The U.S. Navy just spent $13 on an aircraft, and the deadliest weapon on board isn't what you think. It doesn't fire missiles. You could watch it all day and miss it, but it's already changing how the next war gets fought. Hit subscribe, because what I'm about to show you will make you see naval warfare completely differently. The $13 billion question. The Ford-class carrier program became one of the most expensive projects in American history, and critics had a field day with it. $13 billion for a single ship sounds obscene. Until you realize what the Navy was actually purchasing. They weren't buying a bigger boat. They were buying time. Weaponized previous carriers could cycle aircraft. Sure, but they did it at a pace that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1960s. The Ford changed the equation entirely. It generates 3 times the electrical power of a Nimitz-class carrier, enough to run a small city. That power doesn't just turn lights on. It feeds systems that compress into minutes. But here's what nobody tells you about that price tag. The Navy wasn't comparing it to building one old carrier. They were comparing it to the operational cost of running multiple carriers to achieve the same over 30 years. When you do that math, suddenly $13 billion starts looking like a bargain. But the real cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in something far more uncomfortable, that the Navy had ignored for decades. The invisible enemy. And every military planner knows that. Missiles sink ships, and jets win battles. But there's a third enemy that's destroyed more operational plans than any weapon system: time friction. It's the accumulated minutes lost between every action on a carrier deck. The 30 seconds it takes to reposition an aircraft. The 2 minutes waiting for an elevator. The 5-minute safety check that can't be rushed. Individually, these delays seem trivial. Across hundreds of sorties, over days of operations, they compound into something lethal. The Nimitz-class carriers, for all their power, were designed when the Navy assumed they'd fight short. But modern conflicts don't work that way. They stretch across weeks. Testing endurance over explosiveness during operation, inherent resolve against ISIS, and carriers found themselves grinding through sustained operations that exposed every bottleneck in their design. Aircraft waited in queues. Crews worked past exhaustion, managing work that hadn't been optimized in decades. What the Navy discovered wasn't just inconvenient. It was strategic poison that threatened the entire concept of carrier dominance. The speed nobody talks about. Forget top speed, forget how many a carrier can push through the water. There's a different speed that decides wars, and it's called sortie generation rate. This measures how many times a carrier can launch, recover, refuel, rearm, and relaunch its aircraft in a 24-hour period. For decades, American carriers averaged around 120 sorties per day during normal operations. Yeah, that sounds impressive, until you realize it's barely changed since the 1980s. Despite massive advances in every other military technology, the Ford class was engineered from the keel up to hit 160 sorties per day, with surge capacity reaching 270 sorties when needed. That 40 sortie difference doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply it across a week of. That's 280 reconnaissance missions or air superiority patrols that an adversary has to defend against. But here's the part that should terrify any opponent. The Ford doesn't just hit those numbers in perfect conditions during peacetime demonstrations. So here's my question. If you were planning to fight the U.S., would you rather face that exhausts itself in 3 days, or one that's still launching strikes in week 2? Why old carriers can't compete? The Nimitz class wasn't a failure. It was a masterpiece of 1970s engineering that served brilliantly for 40 years, but it was built around assumptions that no longer hold. Steam catapults require a small army of technicians and regular maintenance cycles. They launch aircraft at fixed power settings, which means heavier planes need multiple or reduced fuel loads. The weapons, elevators move barely faster than a commercial building elevator. Crew size on a Nimitz runs around 3,000 Two, just for ship operations. Not counting the 2,500 person air wing. That's 5,700 sleep and stay combat effective for months at sea. The Ford dropped ship crew to 2,600 through automation. Those missing 600 sailors represent bottlenecks that no longer systems that now run themselves. Processes that no longer require human intervention at every step. But cutting crew size revealed something unexpected about how carriers actually fail in combat. The China calculation. Chinese military planners don't lose sleep over American carriers because they're big or powerful. They lose sleep because of where they can go and how long they can stay there. The first island chain, the string of territories from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, represents China's defensive perimeter. Any carrier operating inside that chain sits within range of hundreds of land-based missiles, submarines, and aircraft. But here's the problem China faces. Their defensive strategy assumes American carriers will behave like they always have, launch a major withdrawal to regroup, return for another. The Ford class breaks that assumption by refusing to pause. Instead of massive strikes followed by lulls, it applies continuous that forces Chinese to remain active around the clock. Air defense radars that stay on burn through components faster. Missile crews that can't rest make mistakes. Command centers processing constant threat get overwhelmed. The real nightmare for China isn't that the Ford is harder to... It's that Chinese defenses might bleed themselves dry, trying to survive its operational tempo without the carrier firing a single shot. The elevator that changes everything. The advanced weapons elevators on the Ford became a national joke. They were billions over budget and broke down constantly during testing. Critics called them the perfect symbol of Pentagon incompetence. What those critics missed was why the Navy refused to abandon them, despite the problems. On a Nimitz class, moving a bomb from the weapons mag to the flight deck takes, on average, 3. The new elevators were designed to do it in 60 seconds. That 12-minute difference translates into hours saved across a day of operations. But speed was only part of the equation. The old elevator, shackled by fragile operational windows, this new beast harnesses linear motors thriving in conditions that would cripple the old fleet entirely, slashing the crew requirement by 70%. Surrendering the heavy lifting to cold, hard, the Navy forced the tech to submit. And when it finally obeyed, sortie rates exploded, matching the most aggressive model. The controversy was never a debate on mechanics. It was a question of nerve. Would the Navy, the very soul of carrier aviation, on a machine that has never tasted war? That wager faces a crucible we all fear. And the result will dictate dominion over the seas for 50 years. Picture the chaos when the system bears the crushing weight of combat. Give me your tactical assessment below, or does it break? The most dangerous weapon is this secret asset isn't a sophisticated, it isn't even the electromagnetic catapults that captured the world's attention. The weapon is, and it's lethal in the fact that it doesn't look like a weapon. Conventional power announces itself with fire. While ordnance delivers visible devastation, tempo is the silent killer that denies the adversary. The one commodity every military force requires to survive. Time to think, time to repair, time to adapt. When a carrier sustains 160 sorties a day for weeks on, the enemy faces a strategic equation with no solution. Do they keep air defenses active, constantly burning out components and breaking their crews? Or do they stand down to recover, accepting the inevitability of a strike? The moment they blink, do they spread defenses thin to blanket the zone, or mass them tight and leave fatal gaps? Every option leads to ruin, because the carrier denies them the luxury of optimization. The Ford class evolves the carrier from a mere siege weapon into a relentless machine of attrition that wins by rather than a single decisive blow. This is why the $13 billion is just, the Navy didn't just buy a ship. They purchased to dominate inside the enemy's decision cycle, continuously forcing them to react, never to act, until their errors compound into total collapse. That is the true secret weapon. The most lethal asset on a modern supercarrier isn't the ordnance it fires. It lies in the sheer, unleashed precisely when the enemy prays. That is the paradigm shift, rewriting naval doctrine. If you now grasp the true lethality, support the mission, and subscribe for advanced military intelligence that operates far beyond the mainstream.